Je me lance. Donc, bonjour, bonjour à toutes et tous. Hello everyone. Alors, vous pouvez, pour les francophones, activer la retranscription en direct en anglais en cliquant sur un bouton qui se trouve en bas de votre écran Zoom, transcription en direct. Donc, I am Paul Bouet, a PhD candidate and lecturer at the École d'architecture de la ville et des territoires Paris-Est, Université Gustave Eiffel. And we are here today for the first lecture of this series entitled Renewed Histories, or Nouvelles Histoires. And as the talk will be in English, I will say a few words in this language. So before introducing our guest, Charles L. Davis II, I will briefly present the whole series of lectures. This series, which I am co-organizing with my colleagues, Associate Professors Fanny Lopez and Frédéric Moquet, was born out of discussions we had in the Architecture School of Paris-Est. In recent years, we have been seeing a rise of concerns over racial injustice, gender inequalities, and environmental degradation, in the public debate as in the academic discussion. But our own field of study, the history of architecture, seemed a little indifferent to these issues. This is why we decided to take these issues as questions, scientific questions, to revise our own research and teachings. And for that, we sought to begin a collective discussion. This led us to invite a panel of prominent scholars who are working on these issues, to learn from them, and eventually to help us reconsider the curricula of our school. During the coming weeks and months, the speakers we have invited will thus show us how renewed histories of architecture can be composed. Histories more attentive to the issues raised by colonial and post-colonial studies, by gender studies, as well as by the environmental humanities at large. Histories which aim at changing the way we are looking at architecture and practicing it. The lectures will thus offer as many examples of how histories of architecture in touch with the present concerns can be written, leading us to question the canonical methods and dominant narratives. Our guest of today is a leading voice for these renewed histories. We are extremely pleased to welcome Charles L. Davis II for this first lecture. Charles is an associate professor of architectural history and criticism at the University of Buffalo. He was trained as an architect and received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of the book Building Character, the Racial Politics of Modern Architectural Style in 2019, and co-editor of the most acclaimed Race and Modern Architecture, a critical history from the Enlightenment to the present, published in 2020 with Irene Chang and Mabel O. Wilson. Charles is currently working on another book, tentatively entitled Black by Design, an interdisciplinary history of making modern America, which will examine the contribution of Black artists and architects in shaping the built environment from the Harlem Renaissance to Black Lives Matter. So now, Charles, I leave you the floor for your presentation. And if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat or ask it directly at the end of the talk. We will have a little time for that.
Great. No, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to speak here, as well as to contribute to your search for radical alternative pedagogies, radical alternative histories, and to discover ways of mining the influence of race and racial identity upon architectural production and architectural knowledge. I will be speaking in English instead of French. I apologize for this kind of cultural difference here, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to be on the same page. I'd like to start by saying that I'm giving this presentation on the unceded lands of the Seneca Nation in the United States. And this is a space in Western New York. And a lot of this history of uncontested territories affects my university directly. So I'm the direct beneficiary of this land. And as a kind of complicit steward of this territory, I'm trying to give justice to the kinds of painful histories that have affected us and Native Americans in this country. Now I'm going to, I'd like to share a presentation. It says here though that the host has disabled participant sharing. That maybe we can fix that. Okay, there we go.
Can I think, yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the subject that we agreed on this today. Let me start from the very beginning. About the idea of organic nationalism and the ways that nationalism in the 19th century was based on an idea of nature and an idea of indigeneity, and the ways that indigeneity were discussed through the production and materiality of architecture. I'm particularly interested in the historiography of Euro-American architecture theory. And so I'm going to try and outline for you here the ways that race and style integrated with one another in Western Europe and then migrated to the United States through the history of ideas, through translations, through shared architectural design strategies. And I'd like to share with you a little bit of work from my own monograph, Building Character, as well as parts of my chapter from Race and Modern Architecture, just to give you a sense of the continuity of this work and the ways that race and style came together. And then hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation about this as we move forward. So I'll start by saying that Building Character, for me, is a revisionist intellectual history of the racial discourses that were established by proponents of architectural organicism in the 19th century. It traces the continued relevance of human body metaphors after the decline of Vitruvianism in European and North American architectural style debates to locate the racial content of national architectural styles of the past. And I'm particularly interested in the times when dramatic changes in political discourse, dramatic changes in migration and territories solicited a discussion about the body politic and the formation of the nation itself, and the ways that architecture has come to, in the words of Patrick Wolf and Lorenzo Vercini, to legitimize the types of colonial discourses that the nation has established. So in the United States, this would be settler colonial discourses about European settlers being viewed as natives in the United States, displacing the indigeneity of Native Americans themselves and challenging the indigeneity of subsequent waves of settlers to this territory. The paradigm of architectural organicism that I'm going to talk about was really founded on a belief in science and the relation of science to architectural discourse. And I explore the ways that the physical appearances of race and style categories themselves were thought to be regulated by a common set of organizational principles in nature. And I want to illustrate this a little bit for you. Here are three images here. One of them is at the very far left, is an image by the botanist Carl von Linnaeus, looking at the relationship between physical plant species and understanding the ways that physical appearances might dictate the way that he created what would later be called typologies. And I'm very interested in the text in the way that typology, physiognomy, and character were used to translate scientific principles about nature into architectural discourse, and particularly in the ways that visual appearances, spatial protocols, and structural systems were thought to be identified with specific groups of people. By the turn of the 19th century, rather, we get the fields of ethnography and ethnology, exploring the ways that human differences now start to create typologies amongst one another. And I really like this illustration because it helps us to see the types of things that were thought to be evidence of these changes. So it's clear that we're looking at groups of people based on physical appearances like skin color. Very often, they would also consider things like hair texture, dentition, clothing, and culinary practices. But in some of these images, you can also see some of the architectures and material cultures that were associated with each space. And this was thought to be distributed naturally through a kind of geographical distribution of mankind. So as we moved and migrated from one area to another, we would produce difference, almost as naturally as nature produced difference. By the end of the 19th century, we had architectural historians, architects and architectural historians, some of whom, like Viollet-le-Duc here on the very far right, would combine histories of ethnography and ethnology with histories of architecture to give us now a progressive story of how different cultural differences and architectural typologies would emerge over time. And what's interesting about Viollet-le-Duc's text is that it's one of the first in architectural history to explicitly show racial profiles of Aryan men, of Asian and so-called Negro typologies as evidence of the ways that architecture evolved over time and across Europe and across the globe. I really like this illustration as well. It was produced by American scientists in the mid-19th century. It's officially titled A Regional Chart of Zoological Typologies. So here we're understanding mankind as part of zoology and part of the natural world. And at least for contemporary audiences, I try to point out the difference between the first two rows. So in the first row, we get what we typically think of as racial difference, usually identified by skin color, usually identified by certain elements of dress. But underneath that, what we see are the racial profiles, primarily identified by the skull and the skull shape. And so for Knott, Glidden, and Morey, this second category was more truthful than the first. It wasn't the physical appearances on the outside, but the structure of the human body as it migrated around the world that supposedly produced the differences that we see. So when we look across, or down rather, this chart, we understand the human body as one element of a typological distribution that parallels the typological distributions found in nature, both in the animal kingdom and in the flora and fauna itself. And so this is the beginning of seeing the universality of this idea of cultural difference. And this particular diagram was in support of the idea of multiple species as opposed to a single species of mankind. So they're experimenting with the idea that Blacks are literally a different species than whites, are literally a different species than red-colored peoples and yellow-colored peoples in the past. So within the scientific context, I'm really interested in what is happening with the anthropomorphic metaphors of Vitruvian architectural theory. In most standard histories, we talk about them as if they just disappeared, as if the new sciences of the human body, biology, anthropology, completely replaced any need to reference Vitruvian anthropomorphic ideals. But when you actually read the architectural theories, you realize that architects are still referring to bodily metaphors, notions of corporeality, notions of circulation, notions of structure. And for me, what's interesting are the ways that new scientific references start to racialize our understanding of these bodily concepts. And so I look at and try and trace the ways that instinctive processes of nature are used to stylize living organisms in scientific discourse, and how architects try to create an analog to this in their design processes, or what I call a sort of simulation of the process of natural selection through the means of historicism to create new architectural styles that are appropriate for the current moment. We can see this in illustration form if we think back to the illustrations of Vitruvianism, from the Vitruvian man to the caryatids themselves. There's an idea of an idealized universal body set by the divine world, and usually understood through proportions and proportionality. And that somehow this notion of proportion would be true for all types of human beings. By the time we get to the 19th century, this idea is very different. We get a notion of the human body that is specific to geography, that is specific to the diet and raw materials and the stimuli of regional influences. And we also get, dating back from the experimentation of the École des Beaux-Arts from folks like Claude Perrault themselves, this idea of creating typologies, in this case, he's using the language of species to talk about the ways that column orders are established. And there's a rationalism there that seems to move beyond what can be found in the antique world. It's something that we believe, or we start to believe, can be understood just through the study of science, just through the study of proportionality itself. And so this idea that regional differences are rationally undergirded by certain natural principles starts to take hold in a slightly different way. And so in my book, I try to show how these conceptual parallels resulted in a set of design strategies that abstracted the principles of nature in ways that personified the behavior of buildings. And I'm really interested in the ways that designers start to think of buildings as bodies, and bodies that directly relate to their environments and that start to mirror the characters of those that they serve. So for example, at the Polytechnic, we can see that the way that architectural program is understood, if we just take some of these diagrams and we put them together as if they were an animation, we could literally imagine them changing to adapt to the context that they're in, whether that's the site itself, whether that's the program itself, changing its form the way that a scientist might understand a polyp or an amoeba to change its form in relation to a particular kind of context. We also get this notion of treating buildings as if they are found specimens within nature. So we get the comparative analysis of type forms, all drawn up to the same scale, in the same ways that the entomologist will pin a species of insects on the wall and compare them for their physical elements of similarity. And so the very way that we are starting to understand form and formal difference is an analog of the scientific ways of understanding the natural world. And so I really try to suggest that between the fall of Vitruvianism and the rise of modern architecture as a kind of mature discourse in the 1910s and 20s, we have a period where we're experimenting with human body metaphors that were implicitly created by the racialization that occurs as a result of scientific rationalism in the architectural style debates. And that in order to create architectural characters that mirror the populations that they serve, we're looking back to some of the elements of character that originate from racial difference, cultural differences, language differences, culinary practices, and material culture. All of these elements of ethnography start to give us clues as to how to update antique elements of architecture for use in the present, to revive the so-called spirit of a people from its past material culture into its present. One of the best illustrations of this is Gottfried Semper's comparison of the Egyptian situla and the Greek hydria. He chose these forms specifically because they both combined the form of their practical objects with the representation of peoples. And he read the forms in the same ways that people would read the physiognomy of racial typologies on peoples. And so for Semper, just as a rehearsal of what he was saying, in geometrical terms, the Egyptian situla is organized hierarchically along a top-down axis, whereas the Greek hydria takes that same arrangement but expands it along the horizontal axis. And so according to Semper, this was illustrative of the difference between a kind of monarchical, hierarchical society versus a democratic and free society. And this notion of political discourse would somehow affect everything in the culture, from the distribution of its practical arts, to the physiognomy of its peoples, to the kinds of architectures that each culture would be able to produce. And so inherently within Semper's work, there is a kind of spectrum of work that moves from primitive to advanced, and that moves from hierarchical spiritual systems to more democratic political systems. What's interesting about Semper that's different from others of his time period, Viollet-le-Duc, Karl Bottiger, etc., is that he thinks of the changes that occur from these different types, from one type to another, to be incremental and the result of the exposure of one culture to another. So literally, the history of ethnography becomes the engine by which we see formal differences start to occur. And this leads a lot of folks to start to create progressive histories to illustrate what was happening in the past. And so with this background, I try to show the ways that certain ideas in European modern architecture transcribe and disseminate over into the North American context. In part one of the book, I look at the Aryan character of Alpine architectures, particularly the architectures occurring along the French-Swiss Alps and how they cross Europe, and the ways that architects understand these cultures as crossing their contemporary political boundaries, establishing a kind of connective fabric for the different cultures in Europe that date all the way back to the Aryan migrations of ethnographical histories. And I'm particularly interested in the ways that this notion of Aryan migration theory establishes an origin myth for vernacular architectures along some of these Alpine routes. So in chapter one, I look at the ways that Viollet-le-Duc thinks about the revival of Aryan character in his own study of this work, particularly in his state-commissioned cartography of the Alps in the French-Swiss region, and his reconstruction of Viollet-le-Duc, which is a kind of masonry translation of a wooden vernacular architecture, architecture that he believed was brought to the plains below from the mountains above by the Aryans themselves, and then disseminated amongst some of the contemporary nations of Europe. He illustrates this in his book, History of Human Habitation in All Ages. And this is the book where he shows side by side architectural typologies alongside racial typologies to give us a sense of how, literally beginning with Aryan migrations from the antique world, we can move up to French medieval architectures as he understood them. The chapter two looks at the ways that Gottfried Semper then uses ethnography and architectural design to both trace and to continue the tectonic origins of German character. Following architects like Leo von Klenze in Germany, he's really interested in the ways that so-called primitive wooden architectures in the mountains preserve, in a kind of ossified manner, the origins of the German nation state, and understanding the ways that architectural styles, especially around the time of German unification, when there's a lot of debate around which linguistic basis and which religious basis the nation should be unified. I argue that Semper is really trying to understand the antique origins that connect the plurality of the present in order to revive a macro style that would serve as a kind of modernist umbrella to bring the country back together, literally trying to use design to figure out how to move beyond the limitations of the political moment in the present. These speculations lead me then to look at part 2, which examines the whiteness of American architecture. I should say that I'm assuming here in this section that American architecture is understood as a single label to identify the architectures of European settlers within a settler colony. So this positioning American architecture in this way does two things. One is that it critiques a kind of post-rationalist understanding of American architecture as multicultural, as embracing of all differences, when if you read the language of the 19th century, you realize that this was not the case. There was a lot of particularism, particularly looking through the lens of Anglo-American notions of the body politic. But it also assumes that America, or the United States, is a settler colony, and not something that does not involve or participate in the language of colonialism. And so both of these things, both correcting the post-rationalist ways in which architects like Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright are read as building an American architecture for all peoples, both all classes and all races, but also built specifically building an architecture that legitimizes a settler colonial conception of the state, helps us to identify explicitly the whiteness of American architectural discourse and the ways that difference, particularly by African Americans and even white ethnics like Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, was progressively added over the course of American history by expanding the franchise of whiteness to certain groups while excising certain groups from that discourse. So in this, I'm really interested in the exclusively white definitions of national character that have been whitewashed from our history, but that actually provide a foundation for architectural discourse today. And in this entire book, I'm really assuming that we understand architecture as the European art of building, as it was established in Western Europe and disseminated to the United States. There are different notions of architecture within the US, both as a result of the design build culture or the guild culture of that time period, as well as the forms of material culture by social minorities who were not allowed to enter the professional ranks of architecture. So I'm looking at the ways that professionalized architecture in the US were established along the model of the French École and exclusively within a Eurocentric framework. So this leads me to talk about Louis Sullivan and the ways that the concept of physiognomy helps him to think about architectural character, both as a kind of broader scientific concept that he then operationalizes within architectural design, but also as an evolving political notion that the American race would start to develop type forms that would be indicative of a common culture itself, both in terms of its history of arts and letters, its history of architecture and material forms, but also in terms of the types of people it would produce as indigenous to its shores, literally transforming the national origins of the European settlers that came before into a kind of amalgamized personality or an amalgamized race. And within this space, you get the debates about which national origins will best combine to produce the most virile and productive American. And you get the rise of miscegenation laws that try and separate the races, primarily along the lines of whiteness. Who can be identified as white in terms of the most productive stock coming over from Western Europe, and who is not white, who should be locked outside of and made servile within this new kind of space. And so within this kind of discourse, what I find interesting is that Sullivan starts to think about physiognomy through form in a universal way. He's trying to understand the physiognomic characteristics of things like what Viollet-le-Duc would study, the physiognomy of mountains and mountain faces, and the ways that tectonic plates moving changes the face of such inorganic materials, as well as the way that natural principles change the physiognomy of natural species, both things that he finds in nature, and nature is a very important influence for Sullivan. He would take this idea of botany and universalize it through a kind of abstract geometrical practice, where he's not imitating specific species of plants, but just the idea of nature producing botanical difference. And particularly this unique reading of nature, this abstract reading, as something that's indicative of the potential of the American nation state itself. And then within his text, I think what's also really interesting to take note of is that he uses physiognomic terms to describe the people in his life. He talks about his father and mother in physiognomic terms. He describes himself in physiognomic terms, his business partner in physiognomic terms. And then he goes on to describe his architecture in physiognomic terms that produce stable typologies within the American nation state. And so I'm interested in the ways that physiognomy becomes a kind of universal principle through which Sullivan understands his indigeneity within this space. And as an Irish American, how he makes a bid for himself to be understood as fitting within the Anglo-American notion of character in this context. Then in chapter 4, I look at William Lescaze and the Americanization of the international style in the wake of most of these theories of architectural organicism. And I'm really interested in the ways that there are echoes or reverberations of this previous discourse of nationalism in a so-called international style. And the ways that from the very beginning, even though internationalism was an ideal within this kind of avant-gardist practice, there were always ways in which the local and the national were inscribed within this practice. And so I try to trace the ways that William Lescaze himself, an immigrant who comes into the US, creates an architecture for white ethnics who are Americanizing within this context, particularly in the form of the first federally funded public housing project, Williamsburg Houses in New York City, where he takes both the tradition of concrete public housing that he understands from the European context and was trained within, and combines it with the social housing experiments of the United States that were constructed in brick. And this dual materiality produces a physical context wherein white ethnics from Central Europe and Eastern Europe could be Americanized and legitimized as white Americans within the context of the United States, where they were viewed suspiciously because they did not appropriate the elements of Anglo-Americanism that tended to identify the hegemonic definition of the American body politic at that time period. So having just sort of giving you a brief overview, I'm going to look at a few examples within chapter 3, just to give you a sense of some of the evidence that I use to support this argument and some of the ways that I'm reading race within the archive itself. And then I'll talk a little bit about one chapter from Race and Modern Architecture that extends this argument to other parts of the Midwest. Chapter 3 looks at the ways that Louis Sullivan engages in what was broadly understood as a search for an American architecture within the middle west of the country. So if you think about it geographically, the very east of the country, there were the original states that were established by the European powers as literal colonies. And then there was the revolution that becomes a post-colonial territory. And then Manifest Destiny leads the nation in a rush to settle the rest of the continent. And the first wave that they move to, as they're moving west and literally trying to spread Western civilization westward in the US, is the middle west of the United States. Now, this has become a kind of storied geography in America. People refer to it as the heartland of America. It's identified as the place where the most indigenous forms of pioneer culture, the ranch homes, the pilgrim settlements were established as a means of replacing the indigeneity of Native Americans. And so in this search for American architecture, we get Sullivan in Chicago in the Middle West, establishing a kind of modern idiom that is meant to replace the European revivalisms on the East Coast, to bring us closer to a kind of authentic, autochthonous form of American architectural form. And so I look at the ways that this notion of Americanism both is spread within his architectural practice, where he learns it, how he establishes it through his training at the Beaux-Arts and coming back to the United States, but also the tensions that are embedded within this search for a synthetic formal representation of Americanism. The ways that Jewish American identity doesn't fit squarely into this practice, and the ways that Black Baptist congregants, as they inherited Sullivan's buildings on the south side of Chicago, expands the very notion of Americanism that was originally conceived, because it lay outside of the notion of whiteness that Sullivan established for himself. So in order to get to the intellectual foundations of this, particularly for Sullivan, we have to look at some of the American arts and letters and the traditions of literary traditions of the transcendentalist ideals that he looked to. Looking to writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, both of whom were in the very early years of American arts and letters, particularly in the mid-19th century to the 20th century, were held up to be the forebears of a unique American tradition in literature. Something that was comparable to what people believed were the heights of English literature. And so this idea of distinguishing oneself as being just as good as the nations of Europe, and particularly of Western Europe, France, Germany, and England, in this case particularly. And central to this discourse of transcendentalism, as it was taught by Emerson and Whitman, is this reliance upon nature and the way that the natural resources of America would make it a virile state in a space that would actually lead the West by taking the old traditions and old stock of Western Europeans and reviving them in a new kind of endemic environment that would allow for them to thrive differently. And so within this, the idea of character becomes very important, not just the notion of character in terms of character that one makes through the notions of you are what you eat, modulating through self-discipline, etc., that you're a result of your natural environment, but also character as a self-made personality, that you are the result of the ways that you learn from the natural world and develop that into a full sense of self. And so for Sullivan, he believed that his job as an architect was to create a material poetry that paralleled the poetry for America that was established by Emerson and Whitman. Now, what's interesting is that both of these intellectual forebears had very restrictive notions of race and racial identity in the United States. Both of them acknowledged the presence and contributions of African Americans, but primarily through the lens of what it meant or what it said about white peoples in America. So both Whitman and Emerson supported abolition, not because they acknowledged the humanity of Black Americans, but because they wanted to save the morality of white Americans. And through that lens, they understood that white Americans should not be enslaving peoples, but in the same token and in the same breath, they acknowledged and thought that Black Americans were inferior and that Native Americans were inferior to whites, and that there would be a natural settling in a hierarchy, social hierarchy, where whites would naturally lead and Blacks would naturally serve. We know this from several different writings. I'm showing you here an example from an op-ed that Walt Whitman wrote for the Brooklyn Daily Times, where he says about the mixing of white and Black Americans, who believe that the whites and Blacks can never amalgamate in America. So remember, amalgamation is the creation of this one single racial typology, or who wishes it to happen. Nature has set an impassable seal against it. Besides, is not America for the whites? And is it not better so? As long as the Blacks remain here, how can they become anything like an independent and heroic race? There is no chance for it. And so within this kind of discourse of manifest destiny, settling the nation, but understanding a natural hierarchy between the races, we get Sullivan being exposed to different forms of physiognomic representation. Some in the form of caricature that he learned when he was learning to draw and design at the École des Beaux-Arts. We look at the different journals that he looked at during that time period, and both he and other folks from his studio would use to practice their drawing. We see the illustration of the moneyed Jewish man, or the wandering Jew, particularly in this French context. But we also, when we look at his library, we understand that he continued to learn when he returned back to the United States through illustrations like this one, Illustrated Physiognomy by Professor Alfred E. Willis, where he looks at the forms of the eye and the nose and the mouth as representations of someone's inner character, and understands this to be a kind of science, an art that he could use to read peoples in the moment. And what's interesting is that it doesn't just stop there being in his library, but we notice fragments of this thinking in his own writings. So when we read the autobiography of an idea and we see him describing certain peoples, he's literally cribbing Willis's language to describe some of the folks that he is around. Here's his description of Denkmar Adler, who was his business partner. He was a heavy-set, short-nosed Jew, well-bearded, with a magnificently domed forehead, which stopped suddenly at a solid mass of black hair. He was a picture of sturdy strength, physical and mental. Now, it's important to note here that even though he's using the Jewish nose as a representation of this person, he's representing this Jewish subject in a positive light. So he's trying to be progressive in the ways that he's showing Denkmar Adler to be someone who is a no-nonsense, very savvy business person, sort of level-headed, sturdy, almost like a mountain face in that sense. He would also describe his father in less than picturesque terms as an Irishman whose face emulated the face of a pig, in the kind of stereotype of the Irish farmer who almost seemed to copy the physiognomy of the animals that he took after, as a way of distancing himself from the Irish side of his father's family. So being raised Louis O. Sullivan, he anglicized his name. He distanced himself from his physiognomic traits of his father, and instead lionized the physiognomy of his mother, who was born from French and Germanic roots itself. And so within this notion of physiognomy, both in terms of a physiognomy that is flattering and indicative of an indigeneity that is amalgamated within the US, this is the lens that I use to think about his architecture. So when we look at, for example, the architecture that he produced for Kahil Ath Anshe Ma'ariv Synagogue, which was a building on the south side of Chicago, and we look at the first design of this building, it's very interesting because its entire form has a very synthetic expression. It almost looks like a kind of armory or fortress that one might see in 19th century cities, although this is meant to be the architecture for a synagogue. And so he's treating the synagogue, a religious space, as primarily just a civic monument, and a civic monument that would endure beyond the specificities of its religious principles. And so there's a notion that America is really a space of secularism that allows for the secular to bring people together. So instead of this being a religious space of gathering, it's merely now a public space of gathering, a civic monument that happened to have religious elements, but those elements would be done away with. And he believed this to be the case because he was working with a very radical Reformed Jewish congregation who had incorporated many elements of Enlightenment philosophy into their practice. So if Sullivan got his way, he had the money and the budget and could get the materials, this is what that building would have looked like. But after several rounds of going back and forth with the congregation and its leadership and discussing the budget, we actually get the building on the right. And for me, I find this building to be much more interesting than the imaginary synthetic image of Americanism that Sullivan established. Because what I find is a hybrid expression of Jewish American identity that was actually very true to the lived experience of many folks who were trying to assimilate into the American body politic at that time period. What we have is a remnant of the kind of masonry elements on the ground levels. This is the ground floor level where a lot of the social functions of the space would occur, the daycare, the spaces where women's book clubs would happen, etc. You go up the stairs into the main congregation itself, and then at the ground floor, the space opens up, and you can see both the primary stage and the ground floor. And then on the top levels, which is the clear story levels, this is the level that sits above the kind of the second assembly space, and opens up to the light above. But the character architecturally of this top level is markedly different than the bottom level. In fact, Joseph Siri talks about the window openings looking very much like the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And when you look at some of the illustrations of this time period, you can see that its geometry and some of its ornamentation also echoes the Ark of the Covenant itself. And so there's an explicit attempt to place Jewish religious symbolisms onto the architecture that were completely missing from the original scheme for this building. In my mind, I'm reading this as a visual expression of the hybridity or the hyphen that marks many American cultural groups. Jewish Americans, particularly at this time period, were still contested whites in the parlance of the time period. They had to prove themselves as being Anglo-American in that sense. So the bold representation of their Jewishness at the level of architecture was them asserting the importance of that difference and saying that to be American was also to be hyphen, not just of the Anglo-American variety, but also preserving some of the elements of their origin. And this, I think, was a radical contestation of Sullivan's synthetic approach to American identity, which required the assimilation of the Anglo-American ideal. And this is the first beginnings of a push and pull in this idea, in this notion. I think this continued when this Jewish synagogue was sold to an African-American Baptist congregation. And they came in, and not only did they redo some of the superficial elements of the interior with new paintings, etc., but in terms of the ways that the building performed, they actually atomized some of the synthetic characters or architectures of Sullivan's architecture to create something new. So in the original building, which you can see on the left, you can see a grill at the very top above the stage, and then the stage itself kind of opens up, and there are two alcoves on either side. Those alcoves were spaces where the choir would stand. And literally you'd have a kind of door that would raise, revealing the choir to be a part of the body of the building itself, part of the wall. And that grill at the very top was the original space where the organ would emanate sound. So in Sullivan's design, it is almost as if the building was singing and learned to sing and emanated a kind of expression, a godly expression. In the new design, what we see is a displacing of all of these elements, moving closer to the interior of the congregation and creating a greater bond between the folk who are speaking on the stage and their engagement with the congregation. So if you look at the stage itself in the second image on the right, you see that the space from within the arch in the auditorium or on the stage has spilled out into the congregation. And so the retinue of folks surrounding the clergyman has increased, including the folks who are part of the choir. So some of those members have now spilled out from the wall itself into this space outside. And you'll see also on the second floor, sort of behind where the lamp is hanging, there's a space where you can now see an organ itself. So some of the choir was there on the second floor stands, some of the choir was there in the face of the congregation. And there was an interesting evolution of what ethnomusicologists have called the gospel blues, where they're taking the notion of call and response in the way that the preacher and the way that the choir works, and they're making the congregation a part of what's happening on the stage. So the formal separation that was there with Sullivan's work is changed with the architecture itself. We see illustrations like this one being put into the church, where Jesus and his 12 apostles are rendered as multicultural, racially mixed folks, a hue of browns and whites exchanged between these groups. And for me, what I think is most interesting is that over the course of time, the element that most visibly expressed the hyphenated identity of Jewish Americans, that clear story level, was allowed to disappear, to fall away. And instead, now what we get is a more neutral and neutered expression of that clear story level that would allow for the Black congregation to make an identity for itself. Now, around 2005, 2006, there was a kind of tragic fire on the inside as they were restoring this building. And this elicited a debate about the ways that the building would be restored physically in the present. And there was a contested debate between whether the building should be designed as it was originally designed by Adler and Sullivan, or whether it should be designed according to its state in the 1930s and 40s, when Black gospel music was first being born in the congregation. The congregation decided to go with the latter option. And in the renderings that they established with the presiding architect, the design architect for this project, we can see that, again, the clear story level is held in abeyance. We're not exactly sure what its character will be. And so the notion of the hyphen itself starts to both become a kind of larger, broader category of Americanness, but the specificity of it, we are not certain of what it will become until it later progresses. Now, unfortunately, this project has sort of fallen to the wayside. The property's gone back to the city, and so it will become a different type of project. So we won't ever get an answer to this question. But for me, I think that's actually even more enticing in terms of understanding what this might mean within Adler and Sullivan's lexicon. Okay, I'll just say quickly, just so we have time to discuss, in terms of my essay for Race and Modern Architecture, I really wanted to look at the ways that settler colonial theory established a kind of framework for understanding American architecture, particularly through the ways that Henry Van Brunt created architectures for the expanding infrastructure of the railroad, and the way that the railroad both tried to replace the native culture of Native Americans and to create a new technological and industrial basis for European settler indigeneity within the state. Now here I'm thinking specifically about the notion of settler colonialism and the ways that this requires the myth-making of new European indigeneity. And here are some of the distinguishing characteristics themselves. I will share this with you so you can sort of look through it more leisurely. But what I think is really interesting are the mythologies that occur within a nation bent on manifest destiny that piggybacks on the technology of the railroad. We get photographs like this one, where the white ethnics, particularly those who are competing for inclusion within the Anglo-American category, the working class ethnics, are seen to be the heroes who built this railroad together. But what we are not seeing are the Chinese laborers, the coolie laborers that also worked to produce this railroad. They're written out of this picture. And this echoes the thinking of period boosters of the 19th century, people like William Gilpin, who thought of the railway as something that would create a kind of cosmopolitan network that would connect the nations of Western Europe in that kind of geography of the Atlas with the United States, specifically calling to the problems of race that would be solved by the railroad itself. So in this illustration, notice this kind of broad swath of red, which is the notion of this geographical band that's supposed to connect him and his location in America to the nations of Europe. And he's thinking about literally building railroad infrastructure that would connect these territories. We can see the circle centering over the Middle West, over the heartland of America. And he talks about the ways that then this middle band of infrastructure would have satellites that would go north and south to allow for white men to colonize the non-white territories of the globe. And so he's already understanding the world in the notions of the global north and south as we understand it today, and in terms of raw material serving the middle spaces through this railroad territories. Even period notions of the railroad after this time period show the disappearance or replacement of the Native Americans. In William Fox's The Iron Horse, we get a sense of the smoke from the railroad itself, creating a kind of mist that looks like the buffalo of the plain bison. So we're seeing the Indian sort of lamenting the replacement of his own indigeneity and his connection to plains culture by a new mechanized culture. And in the second image, we see the pilgrim sort of dressed as a new indigenous white subject, noting his indigeneity by using the railroad and the Rainbow Railway, right? Remember the Cosmopolitan Railway from Gilpin, literally leapfrogging over the Plains Indians to connect the pilgrims from the east to other territories in the west. I read Henry Van Brunt's architecture as creating a visual instantiation of an evolutionary discourse of American architecture, starting with the rudimentary culture of the plains settlers, which literally were brought over on the train car from factories in the east to look like barns and rudimentary elements, and then taken off of the rail line and put along the side of the track as a kind of temporary station. And then as each place built its density, they would replace that space with a more permanent building and a more permanent building. So as hotels were necessary, as you had casinos and entertainment established, you see a European revivalist style. And then finally, you had Henry Van Brunt bringing over the new modernist idiom that would replace that element, literally creating kind of pictorial image of evolution of American European settler culture into the modernist idiom of the present. It's important to note that Henry Van Brunt participated in several local cultures as well. This is a flower parade that would happen around the town itself, and I want to show you, sort of the representation of this as well. It's sort of following the KKK, which is hard to think of as accidental, kind of translation of this, and this is the route through the city. But then you'd have folks who would dress like their own form of primitives, thinking of the primitive cultures that existed in the land that laid the groundwork before people came over. And you'd have sort of, fantastic notions of what this might be, as well as the literal parading of Native Americans and people dressed in early settler notions coming through the city. But I also think what's interesting is that there's a kind of atavism that's applied here, where the flowers decorating different forms of automobiles. Here we see the horse-drawn carriage. Here's the actual mechanized automobile. Again, tries to play on this notion of taking the mechanized industrial culture and naturalizing it in a way that shows a kind of return to nature, this return to primitivism. And in this sense, it's taking the elements of Anglo-American culture and allowing for people to perform their indigeneity in different ways, both through seeing primitive cultures and by becoming that primitive culture. And the last thing that I'll note is that for Van Brunt, before he passed, one of the last projects that he participated in was the establishment of a museum to the history of the West, where people would collect different forms of primitive culture from chinoiserie globally, but also in terms of American identity, Native American cultures, the culture of the bushwhackers, and the folks who were part of the prairie explorations, all the way up to modernism itself. Okay, I just wanted to stop here and give us enough time to talk. I appreciate your time and attention, and I hope that we can at least discuss some of the features amongst ourselves.
Okay, so thank you so much, Charles, for this fantastic and very rich, dense lecture. I think you gave us much to think about our concerns in this series of lectures, Renewed Histories. We can now open up the discussion. So if anyone has a question, please ask it directly, preferably in English, but if it is in French, we can try to translate for Charles.
Hello, I've got a question. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to ask a question about Viollet-le-Duc. Do you think, as Martin Bressani suggests, that for Viollet-le-Duc, technical innovation, specifically the use of iron, is related to the supposed qualities of ions?
So can you say the last part of the question again? I lost it there.
Sorry. Do you think, as Martin Bressani suggests in his book on Viollet-le-Duc, that for Viollet-le-Duc, technical invention is related to the use of iron, and is it related to the qualities of irons, as Bressani suggests in his book?
So it's an interesting question. I know that Bressani has been studying Viollet-le-Duc for many years, and his interpretation, even as broad as it is, departs from several others, like Laurent Baudon and others who look at Viollet-le-Duc's work. I do see, within Viollet-le-Duc's notion of iron and how he uses it to visualize modernity, particularly in the replacement of masonry forms of ornamentation and the way he thinks of it structurally, that there's a kind of progressive element there in terms of how he's thinking about it from a kind of purely tectonic material standpoint. In general, I think I could probably agree with that statement. Where I tend to depart from Bressani is where he finds the importance of race in this discourse, and whether he finds the material of iron to be racialized within the French Protestant context and the ways that Viollet-le-Duc understands this material. And so I remember sort of on the first reading of that book, getting the sense that Bressani was writing it as a kind of ghostly presence within the work, that it's kind of there, it's in the air, and it's something that's infecting the work. And for me, I find it sort of more in the DNA of how he's thinking about things, and the way that he structures history, and the way that he believes that type forms work and progress through time. So, for us to get to iron, we'd have to go through different primitive phases and then early modern phases of ornamentation that lead us to the experimentation with iron. And for me, it's really fruitful to kind of compare his view to Gottfried Semper's view, because for Gottfried Semper, this is very incremental and elemental. And for Viollet-le-Duc, I see sharp breaks in what's happening. And I also see a much more schematic understanding of how the progressive history of materiality works. And it's hard for me to look at that and not see him emulating the language of ethnography, emulating the ways that the mixing of different racial groups becomes an engine where the material cultures come together and combine. In my chapter in Building Character, I talk about the ways that this literally creates an engine for understanding the migration of early Aryan cultures. And not surprisingly, it establishes the prototypical floor plan for, the House of the Fawn and other kind of Roman prototypes. And so he's trying to read Aryanism within this particular work. Now, in so doing, I don't think that he's particularly unique, but I think he's just really clear and pretty transparent about it. And so while I can agree with the place of iron, the elevated place of iron that's being read in that history, I have a strong suspicion that it's probably more heavily racialized or connected to the associations, the racial and ethnographic associations that are sort of tacitly understood to play a role within that space. And I think that's a hard thing to get at, right? Like to sort of make transparent what is unstated because everyone kind of agrees on it becomes a difficult thing. And I also find that the character of scholarship on Viollet-le-Duc by folks in France versus folks in the United States to be markedly different in terms of what we tend to look at and experiment. I would imagine, for example, it would be a bit like if someone in France were to write some very radical things about Louis Sullivan or Frank Lloyd Wright or something. Like our relationship to that would be different in those national terms. So I'm hoping that at the very least I'm creating a kind of complementary way of viewing this work, particularly because it's Viollet-le-Duc is not just influential in France, but he's translated all over the world, and he becomes this kind of way of understanding what modern tectonics is supposed to be. So within the United States, he establishes the baseline for what iron means, and how we then take that to create iron facades and think about the literal use of iron in the railway and what that means for our own manifest destiny. It would be surprising to me if Americans were so clever that they were the only ones to make racial associations of iron. That would be the best way that I could answer that question in terms of what I think is probably embedded within Viollet-le-Duc's notion of materiality.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Do we have another question from the audience? If not, I would have one simple question about the consequences of your work for the way we teach the history of architecture in our schools. Is acknowledging the role these racial theories played in the work of renowned architects such as Viollet-le-Duc or Gottfried Semper and in the early modern white architecture enough? Or should we go further in the way we teach? Is acknowledgement enough, do you think?
Mm-hmm. So this is a very important question, I think, because I think the implications to this question have to do with whether you can continue teaching architecture the way that you've been teaching it previously, or whether the center of the discourse, the core of the discipline, has to change and shift. And so for me, so different people are going to have different takes and positions on this. For me, I think that the discipline of architecture that we currently discuss in Western European institutions of higher learning and in the United States is really premised on a European notion of architecture as the art of building. So within that context, I think that especially for folks like in the United States, where we have a multicultural nation, where there are folks who come to us from all different parts of the world with different kind of cultural traditions, I find it problematic to say that how they understand building culture or how they understand the relationship of their culture to the discipline of architecture to be somehow subordinate to some kind of larger hegemonic discourse that should be universalized for everyone. I like to look at it in place-specific ways. So if architecture is the European art of building, then I want to understand what about it is European, what about it is Eurocentric, and I want to understand how it fits within a kind of European discourse and how that would be different in its colonies, how that would be different for subjects within the nation state who are not European, who are not white, and whether architecture in those terms is plastic enough to include their cultural needs, their cultural desires, and their modes of expression. Now, in the little work that I've done in the US that look at this question, with Sullivan defining American architecture through the Anglo-American lens, not being enough to actually fit the needs of Jewish Americans, and definitely not being enough to fit the needs of African Americans. The material infrastructure itself being enough, but the meaning of the architecture not being enough, that these communities actually help the architect to exceed these limited notions of what architecture is. I would hope that that's what we could be doing with our discourse. So for me, what I think needs to happen is when we teach architectural history, I do two things, and I don't have the slide with me, but I ask my students to go to the bibliography of and the index of their textbooks, and to look at the buildings that are most cited, and to give me a visual illustration of them. And when they do this, what we tend to find is that there's a kind of formal evolution of different types of buildings and styles and approaches, and the students are initially excited. And then I ask them to find images of the architects who produced those buildings and to map where those buildings are located and to put that underneath the formal innovation that they see. And what they quickly start to realize is that this is a very geographically specific history of architecture. It adheres to the global north. It has to do with the moneyed and the most elite of certain spaces, and that even within these nations, we don't get the history and stories of the minor voice. And I asked my students at the end of that class, is that definition of architecture enough? Like, it is the notion of a monumental architecture that tends to adhere to power, tends to reproduce those elements, whether it's European or not, like whether it's just sort of in the class, Marxist sense, is that enough? Or should our history of the built environment be more fulsome, more broad? And so I've come to progressively, move away from a kind of monumentalist narrative, where you learn 100 or 150 buildings from different periods, and that becomes the mark by which you understand excellence, because I find that to be rather exclusive. And there's no reason to reproduce the standards of distinction that were specific to each period when we could tell a broader story. And so I always try to include works of vernacular architecture, although I don't label them that. I think that sort of reifies the monumental vernacular division, as well as like the works of entrepreneurs, people who have heavily shaped the built environment, at least in the United States, but are not called architects. So we look at the design of things like shopping malls, and we look at the design of things like highways and infrastructure systems. And we understand also the ways that Levittown established a kind of architecture that really parallels some of the aims of modernist thinkers like Frank Lloyd Wright and others, but because it was so ubiquitous, has sort of been denigrated as sort of vernacular in some way, shape, or form. And the role that the vernacular category plays in just mopping up anything that we don't like and sort of excising it to the outside, except for when we need it, like for a typology that we could return to and then spruce up and make monumental in that form or sense. So I try to expose to my students both the nationalist, the racial, and the class hierarchies that are established by architecture and that define architectural excellence. And I ask them, is this a world that you think is okay? And, I guess like if they seem to find themselves in the center, they may not question it as much. But if you find yourself on the outside, you really want to know, like, how can I sort of radically transform this discourse to speak for me? And I try then to actively model, like I do in the book, Building Character and in Race and Modern Architecture, how can we critique the canon to understand its limits? But I also think that there are things that can continue, that are good, that are useful, that are procedurally productive as design strategies. But to understand when you need to use that language to speak for yourself, or when using that language actually writes yourself out of that historical discourse. And that becomes a very difficult game. But I'm not of the opinion that we should just take everything that's European and throw it out, because I think that that's a worldview, and they were able to produce a worldview that was indicative of what they were doing, and that there are many lessons about creating architectures of indigeneity and formal expression of belonging to the nation, body politic, that one can use. It's just that we continue to do this through a singular lens, which I think is just absurd. We should just pluralize this and provincialize Europe as one of many and allow for a broadening of this discourse. Now, practically speaking, people like Mark Jarzombeck at MIT have helped us to appreciate that the archives of different cultures are not even. We have a tremendous amount of archives for European and European settler cultures, and very few archives for non-white spaces. So in terms of architectural history in a professional school, we are not helping the problem if all we do is teach European history, if we don't help to build the archives of these other groups and spaces. And so I think a core part of historiography in our professional setting, especially since we're the ones who make the architecture and we're the ones who can get to determine, or we're in a place rather to determine what its meaning is, we should participate in that work. We should do some of the heavy lifting. We should be producing oral histories of non-white groups. We should be teaching students to understand how to engage with those elements more so. And so, I think that this is a very difficult thing I'm asking. Like, I'm asking folks who have been trained in a particular tradition and are very proud of this tradition to realize that there's a kind of notion of inequality in the over-representation of that tradition in our pedagogy, and to just be truthful about struggling to make that historiography even. And I think it's productive to show our students how difficult that is, and to let them know that there's a kind of moral payoff for doing this kind of work, that you actually, in the act of doing this, you expand the discourse, because now you have 100 people in a, I don't know, classroom or typical survey trying to do this work imperfectly, of course, and you come back and you talk about what standards by which to do it, but it's not just the work of one person, you know, and it's not just the work of people of color or women or of sexual minorities. It's everybody's work. Like, it's our architectural history. We need to be expanding it. That's what I think needs to happen. But it would require a dramatic transformation of how we teach architectural history to do that. And I think it's mostly just letting people know that they're a part of the work. They're not just a subject of the critique, but they're the ones who are in the privileged position to show us how to do it. I hope this answered your question. I don't know for sure if it does.
Yes, thank you so much. It really very rich, and it really echoes discussions we have with my colleagues and my own thoughts in my work. So you advocate for a broader history rather than a complete another history, if I can sum up like this. And yes, there are many ways to do this, like investigating the role of technologies, for instance, rather than only monumental buildings of so-called vernacular architecture, vernacular times. There are many ways to do this, and we are trying to investigate this as well.
Yeah, I will just say, sort of as a follow-up, so this idea of technology, and I'll say that it was very present at the University of Pennsylvania when I was doing my dissertation there, and subsequently there are entire schools where the pedagogy is really based on technology. But when it's not looked at critically, I think that this notion of technology can easily become a kind of cipher for progressivism, for advanced cultures, that denigrates the status of the vernacular. But when we look at it in purely sort of historiographical terms, a lot of so-called vernacular cultures are modern, meaning that they live in the modern world. They have decided to deal with modernity in a very particular way. There are a certain set of technologies that we deem primitive from our own cultural perspective, but that's a very univocal way of understanding that. And so I think that technology for a lot of folks, especially when they use it in this kind of future-oriented way, that never deals with the present and never deals with the kind of the placement of technology in the global north as segregating against folks in the global south. The racial charge of it tends to disappear, and people try and treat it as neutral. But it's actually a way of, in the parlance of the Greeks and the Romans and in the international style, creating a universal style that's really a colonizing technology. And it colonizes everyone to think like us, as opposed to acknowledging difference. So for me, that's the danger of teaching through technology and not understanding that technology has been the means, the infrastructure by which people have literally colonized other groups. And I think if architects understood that, they would be much more careful with how they deal with technology and understand that it very easily imposes a structure of doing and being that erases the rituals of certain groups, not just like so-called primitive groups, you know, like in the United States, I can talk about the use of technology at Hudson Yards that makes it very difficult for working class people of color, people who don't look like a kind of moneyed financier class to access that space and feel comfortable. That's in a global North context. That's in a space where that's supposed to be a public space. But already, whether you're white, you're not white, whether you're moneyed or not moneyed, technology reinforces and legitimizes the presence of certain bodies over others. And so I think technology in architecture is a really big problem, and it is heavily under-theorized from the social perspective. We tend to theorize it from the notion of optimization and productivity, even in terms of sustainability, but not in terms of race and identity, and understand how technology is a heavy cudgel within the Western discourse to do that. And so, again, I think it just requires theorization. It requires a careful kind of handling of this work, so that we're not actually celebrating things that marginalize us as people and practitioners, but we're actually allowing for a much broader access to the field.
Thank you. I totally agree. In a few words, technology should never be cut from its political and social consequences and meanings. And we will have Jia Hui-Cheng in this series of lectures, and I'm sure he will be wonderful also on this topic. Okay, so I'm afraid we should stop here. So many thanks, Charles, for your talk in the name of all of us. It was really an honor to have you today. And just a brief announcement before saying goodbye. Next week, we will have Lucille Biarrot on the topic déconstruire le genre des pensées, normes et pratiques de l'urbanisme à la même heure. So thank you, everyone. Merci, thank you, Charles, and have a nice day.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.